Governor Johnson, thanks so much for making the time. It's good to have you in the studio.
David, it's great to be on with you.
Okay, so why don't we get a start with who is Gary Johnson? Because I remember you showed up and caused a big splash in the Republican debate last September, I believe, talking about your dogs. That was the most memorable line of that debate, if I remember correctly. That was my dogs have more shovel-ready jobs than President Obama's stimulus package, if I remember correctly.
Oh, the exact thing went something like my neighbor's 2 dogs have created more shovel-ready jobs than this administration.
That's right. Did you plan that out? Was that a line you were waiting for? Or?
Do you know that the radio station in Albuquerque, Jim Villanucci, very listened to AM talk in the afternoon, for a couple of days running, he said, let's get together a list of zingers that I can send Gary Johnson that he might be able to use in this debate.
Yeah.
And he sent me a paper full of zingers, and that was one of them. And, of course, as you know, pulling it out of the hat, if you will, having read them, that's a whole other thing, too.
Yeah, it is more difficult. You have them, and then at the end you go, oh, I could have used that one. Well, let's start with, how did you become governor of New Mexico?
You know, I went in, first of all, I've always believed politics to be a high calling, something that I always wanted to do. I have run for 2 elected offices in my life, governor of New Mexico and re-election as governor of New Mexico. I went and I introduced myself to the Republican Party 2 weeks before I announced. What they said was, we like you, we like what you've got to say, we're going to include you in the process. We've got a completely inclusive party here in New Mexico. You can be a part of everything, but you just need to know that you will never win, that it's not possible to come from completely outside of politics and get elected governor in a state that's 2-1 Democrat. Well, it all happened. I'd like to think it had to do with what I had to say, and I'd like to think my re-election had to do with the fact that rubber actually met the road.
Well, first of all, what made you think when you showed up to the Republicans 2 weeks prior to announcing, what made you think that you could be governor? What was your experience that made you think, yeah, I can do this?
Well, I've been an entrepreneur my entire life. So I started a one-man handyman business in Albuquerque in 1974, and actually grew it to employ 1,000 people. So although people really hadn't connected Big J Enterprises in New Mexico, in Albuquerque with me, when I announced that I was running for governor, the first thing that appeared in print when I was running for governor was Gary Johnson, the triathlete, is running for governor, which I thought was terrific. What does a triathlete know about running state government? I mean, I caught a bit of that rumble. And then, oh, no, this is the guy that owns Big J Enterprises, the largest construction employer in the state of New Mexico. So we were actually running ads on television for people to come work.
Now, what you should have done then is you needed your full name in there to boost the name ID ahead of time. But then again, Big Johnson Enterprises would sound a little odd, I guess, in New Mexico. That might be maybe you chose the right one. It'd have to be Big Gary's. So you run in this company, and it grows to this point. What made you jump into politics? Was it the calling issue that you referred to earlier?
It was something I always wanted to do, believing it to be a high calling. And in retrospect, it was. I really enjoyed the job. It was everything that I hoped it would be. And of course, I make this pitch. Good government was easy. It wasn't hard. It was easy to do the right thing, and the right thing started with looking at issues first and politics last.
How do you do that?
That you would assemble, that politics wouldn't take a role in the decision-making, that whatever the decision, whatever the legislation that has just passed is, setting people to, and I'm a contrarian. I'm just a natural contrarian. You tell me to sign something, I'm not going to sign it just right off the, just as a knee jerk. But understanding legislation and trying to the best of my ability, well, how is this going to advantage, or how is this going to make life better for a New Mexico citizen? Well, in most cases, David, it wasn't going to make life any better at all. In most cases, it was just going to add time and money to have to comply with laws that would then have subsequent rules and regulations to go along with those laws.
You were known as Governor No, I believe. Or no, Governor Veto. Is that correct?
Well, I may have vetoed more legislation than the other 49 governors in the country combined. That may be an embellishment, but I'm waiting for somebody to prove me wrong. I mean, I vetoed 750 bills. I had thousands of line items. Only 2 were overturned, so it made a difference when it came to billions of dollars worth of spending, and it made a difference back to time and money to have to comply with just living.
Yeah, I want you to know I didn't consider that an insult. I thought that
No.
I did not take it.
I did not take it as an insult.
But what you're saying is when a piece of legislation would fall on your desk, you did not look through an ideological lens at all and say, as a libertarian, so to speak, saying, all right, this is going to grow government, therefore I'm going to say no, or this is going to shrink government, therefore I'm going to say yes. You use some other kind of standard that you're saying is, I wanted to improve the lives of our citizens. Well, there's a lot of people who would be clamoring over, well, only if the state has more would their lives be better because they're better cared for. Or others would say, only if there's less. Was there any ideological lens that you would approach these pieces of legislation?
So in that context, everything was a cost-benefit analysis. Everything. What are we spending our money on? What are we going to be spending our money on? And what are we going to get for the money that we spend? And in that context, for the most part, it was no.
All right. Here's something I'm very curious about, because one of the things that's currently being bandied about, and it was when you were running on the Republican side of things, was the need for private sector business experience. You and a couple of others had it. And one of the things that's been pointed out is politics is not the same as a business. What kinds of things did you discover as governor? What kinds of skills did you realize, hey, in the business world it would happen like this, in politics you need a different kind of skill, and how did you adapt to those things?
So, David, when I was running for governor, I said, I'm going to run state government like a business. Best product, best service, lowest price. As governor of New Mexico, what I discovered was you can do just that. That state government was a business and that it could be run like a business. And I point to my reelection. I vetoed as many bills as I vetoed, 750 over 8 years. There was a caricature, an editorial cartoon of me on a pogo stick, and at the end of the pogo stick was the word veto. And I was jumping across the state. Well, I had vetoed every square inch of the state, and that's what I did. So how on earth did I get reelected?
So what was the profit? Was the profit then saving taxpayer dollars?
Yes.
Is that how you would measure the profit?
Exactly.
Because everybody always says that's what's missing from government is the profit incentives. So how did you reward government employees based on that somehow to get that to work?
That if it was the same goods and the same services for less money, always. If it was for better goods and services for less money, always. If it was same goods and services or better same goods and services, same amount of money? Well, no. I mean, again, it was that constant analysis. And yes, the bottom line was spending less money. That was the profit. Profit accruing to the shareholders, which would be everybody that paid taxes.
All right. So now let's jump to the presidential campaign. You started running as a Republican. And as I said, you got the one zinger in that got a lot of national attention, but then you dropped off the face of the earth, and then you made this announcement, hey, I'm going to run on the Libertarian ticket. Why the switch?
Well, first of all, I think that the message that I'm delivering, and it's always been about the message, liberty, freedom, and then balancing that with the checkbook, meaning I believe we need to balance the federal budget or we're going to find ourselves with a country that's collapsed. I believe that. I really believe that. It's a message similar to Ron Paul. It's an agenda similar to Ron Paul. I don't think Ron Paul's going to get the Republican nomination. So what happens to this message when that happens? Well, I hope to carry this forward. I think it's an important agenda for America. And I might also add that from a communication standpoint, it isn't just Ron Paul talking about this stuff. It isn't just me talking about this stuff, but I'm given the opportunity, Ron Paul's given the opportunity. When you and I as individuals hear the same message coming from two different sources, it resonates a little bit more. If it's more than two, if it's a half a dozen, if it were everybody on stage, we'd have that kind of change take place. So this is a process, and it's about changing the world a little bit. That's kind of going back to being governor of New Mexico, running for the office. The idea was to actually say the things that really needed to get done, try and sell the fact that I had a resume to actually deliver on what it is that I was saying. I got the opportunity to do that, and that's why I guess I'm back here to try this at a national level.
With Paul basically taking away your base of support because your messages were somewhat similar, Paul's kind of got a celebrity status right now, which makes it very difficult for you to try and say, "Hey, I'm over here," pay attention. So you go to the third party. In the U.S., our system is not kind to third-party runs. Libertarian Party, what was the percentage in the last election? I want to say it was like 1%. Well,
the best a Libertarian candidate has ever done for president is just over 1%.
So knowing that, when you leave to the next party, you take, I would assume, the folks that were in the two-party system that would sympathize with you, remove them from the two-party system, and then the two dominant parties then, or at least the one that is sympathetic to libertarianism, you take those folks away from the Republican Party. Don't you make the Republican Party more liberal by doing so? I mean, don't you start to isolate or quarantine people who are sympathetic to your vision?
No, I think, I'm back to my experience having run and gotten elected in New Mexico. The state's 2-1 Democrat. I think I garnered just as many Democrat votes along with independents, along with Republicans. I think I have a voice that speaks on behalf of the majority of Americans. And if I may speak with just a really broad brushstroke, the notion that as Americans, I think for the most part, we consider ourselves fiscally conservative and socially liberal. And socially liberal, the notion that government should not be making decisions that you and I should be making.
Well, let's talk about what you actually believe here as far as the spending and the deficit goes, because what you're saying sounds a lot like Mitch Daniels, his new book, describing the danger of the new red menace being the mountain of debt. How would you tackle it?
I am promising to submit a balanced budget to Congress in the year 2013. Now, that's not promising a balanced budget. That's promising to submit a balanced budget. That's a document that's going to be hotly contested and debated. That's a $1.4 trillion reduction in federal spending. And I like to start off by talking about Medicaid, Medicare, and military spending, because if you're not going to address those three, you're not going to get to $1.4 trillion. But that's what we need to do. I'm also promising to veto any legislation where expenses exceed revenue. And, David, you can argue that they will just simply override your veto. Well, that's just what they're going to have to do, and they will. But I'm going to argue that spending in that scenario would be spending lower than any other scenario that you can possibly come up with. And then when it comes to rebooting the American economy, I am promising to advocate on the part of the fair tax. Now, what we need to do is to revamp our entire federal tax system and replace it with a consumption tax. I'm embracing the fair tax. I think that it is a package. It's a complete package. You take out one part of the package, it voids the package. There are several hundred thousand followers of the fair tax. But the fair tax, very simply, does away with all existing federal tax. No more income tax. No more corporate tax, no more withholding taxes from your paycheck. All of that will come out of the proceeds of the fair tax. It's a 23% consumption tax, and before you fall out of your chair, it ends up being cost neutral over a very short amount of time, because contained in that bottle of Coke right there that sells for $1 is 23% tax. You take that embedded, non-transparent tax out. You replace it with a very transparent 23% consumption tax, and what you have is Coca-Cola not having to sell that bottle for $1 anymore. They can sell it for 80 cents to make the same profit. They will, because we're very competitive in this country. So it's really the answer when it comes to our exports, making our exports 23% cost 23% less to send abroad. And it's really the answer when it comes to jobs in this country, because with a zero corporate tax rate environment, if the private sector doesn't create tens of millions of jobs, I don't know under what scenario they will create tens of millions of jobs. Obama, 2 weeks ago, talked about or advocated dropping the corporate tax from 35 to 28, saying that it would stimulate job growth. Well, all right, let's just extend that to zero, and let's see what happens.
Does that include, do your calculations include for the, let's say, the lowest income 20%, would the elimination of the payroll withholding tax and other kinds of hidden taxes take care of their buying power? Is that what you're saying, as far as not harming them additionally?
Well, one of the criticisms of a consumption tax, and it's a rightful criticism, is that it's regressive. So to answer that, the fair tax package issues everyone in the country a $200 a month prebate check. So all of us here would get $2,400 a year from the government, which would allow us to pay the fair tax up to the point of the poverty level. It's kind of an unavoidable amount of fair tax that you're going to have to pay for minimal food, clothing, energy, transportation, heating oil, whatever.
What about the notion that Congress is famous for trying to find little ways of benefiting their own? Let's say it's President Gary Johnson. Through some kind of miracle, you get the entire replacement of the tax code. People are fed up enough. We have this remarkable turnaround. And then you leave office and you have Congress in place. The American people start to fall asleep a little bit. And then all of a sudden you have the ability of congressmen with seniority to start eliminating on the fair tax, giving a little bit of advantage for their particular state and their particular interests, that particular company, and all of a sudden the fair tax becomes an unfair tax. How would you prevent something like that?
You know, what you're pointing out is political reality. What you're pointing out is what does happen. Our present income tax started off as a flat tax.
Yeah, it's full of it now. Yeah,
I think if you think about the fair tax a little bit, that you're going to have one federal tax. That would be a 23% consumption tax. One of the criticisms is, well, gee, they can just raise that tax. Well, I think when it's the only tax, I think raising it would be the nightmare of every politician, which is I'm not going to get reelected if I do that. On the other side, I think there would be pressure to reduce it, not to actually increase it. So when you start nibbling at exemptions, anything is possible once you're out of office. With the best of intention, you can establish the best programs in the world, and then after you leave, they become something completely different. And I have a couple of examples of that in New Mexico, where I actually signed legislation that I wish I would have never, ever signed.
What happened?
I signed a bill that took the Public Regulatory Commission from appointed positions to elected, thinking that people, that's probably a pretty good idea, that by making an elected position, they would be actually more accountable and that people would render judgment on that. Well, it's become political fiefdoms that have resulted in huge increase in bureaucracy in what used to be an agency. I mean, it's ridiculous, and I did it. I was part of it. I made a suggestion on Red Eye, the show the other
Fox
night.
show. Mm-hmm.
I made a suggestion, or what I thought was a really good idea is calories. The restaurants having to post calories on what it is you're eating. I think it's a terrific idea. So I said, isn't this what government would really be good at, is just providing this kind of education, and that it would actually alter behavior of Americans in a good way? That, oh, gee, a Big Mac fry and shake actually is my calorie count for the day. And if you actually were confronted with that, I think we would make healthier choices. Well, what I'm envisioning, David, is my legislation regarding that, which would be the store owner taking a $12 calorie counting book home for the afternoon, coming up with the best guess for calories for the menu, and that would be my legislation.
The trial lawyers love the idea. I can already sense it.
Well, so now I leave office, and we found over an 8-year period, because I would have implemented this the first year, we found over an 8-year period that health has drastically improved in this country, and it's really had to do with this initiative on calories. So now my successor, either whatever party, well, we better have the calorie counting police, because not all calories are reflected accurately. Not all calories are reflected accurately when it comes to fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. And what is the fat? I can just see it becoming the largest bureaucracy in government because of its initial benefits.
Yes, never underestimate the ability of politicians to turn common sense into some kind of bureaucratic oppression.
I allowed the Indian Affairs Agency of Indian Affairs in New Mexico because it came with no money attached. Because that's the only way that I would accept it. No money spent by the state government. So I passed the legislation. Well, guess what? My successor more than funded it.
Did somebody dangle some matching dollars? I would guess that's usually what happens.
Well, in my case, I thought, okay, if this is something that you all want to put your time and effort into, and that it's not going to cost taxpayers a nickel, sure. But what happened is taxpayers are now contributing a lot more than a nickel.
What do you want to see happen to Medicare and Medicaid?
I oversaw the reform of Medicaid in New Mexico. Took it from a fee-for-service model to a managed care model. We improved the healthcare network in the state of New Mexico, and we saved hundreds of millions of dollars. I believe that if the federal government would have block granted the state of New Mexico 43% less money and given me the oversight on how, and by me, my administration,
right,
the oversight on how to deliver health care to the poor, that I could have effectively seen that done with 43% less money. I think that's the same model that needs to apply to Medicare, health care for those over 65. And so that would be my model for Medicaid and Medicare reform, is give it back to the states, 50 laboratories of innovation, best practice. I think that's exactly what would happen.
Isn't that close to the Ryan plan?
Maybe.
What about the military? You mentioned the three things you had to tackle, the entitlement reform and the military. Let's talk about that.
Well, so let's start with a premise that we should provide ourselves with a strong national defense, that it's an obligation of government. It's one of government's fundamental roles. Well, the operative word is defense, not offense and not nation building. And so my budget for 2013, which will be a balanced budget, my promise is a 43% reduction in military spending. What year do you have to go back to get a 43% reduction in military spending? Well, it's 2003. Not that far back. And what does a 43% reduction in military spending look like? Well, it's reducing nuclear warheads from, by the way, I'm not doing any of this in a vacuum. I've had a lot of really smart people help me out on this, but it's reducing nuclear warheads from 2,300 to 500. It's the military that are in uniform and the civilian support staff that goes along with that. It's the military footprint worldwide. It's the 100,000 troops on the ground in Europe. It's 30,000 troops in Japan. It's the same amount of troops in South Korea. It's the conflicts that we're currently engaged in, getting out of these conflicts.
What's your vision for those troops in Europe? Move them out, move them home?
Well, that they would be out of uniform, that this would be the downsize. That I believe the biggest threat to our national security is the fact that we are bankrupt. And let's not forget either that in World War II, at the end of World War II, there was a lot of consternation over 10 million men and women coming back from overseas and the great unemployment that would exist as a result of that. And none of that happened. arguably went through our greatest period of prosperity after that.
Let's turn to a social issue you're very much known for, drugs and drug legalization. Talk about your position there.
Well, I advocate legalizing marijuana. Let's control it, tax it, let's regulate it. I believe we are going to legalize marijuana in this country. 50% of Americans support legalizing marijuana. That number has never been this high, but that was the Gallup poll back in October. 50% of Americans support it. Why? Why do 50% of Americans support this notion now? It's because people are talking about it. And it's an issue that does really well when people talk about it and shine light on it. Look, it's never going to be legal to smoke pot, become impaired, get behind the wheel of a car. But smoking pot, becoming impaired, doing no harm to anyone arguably other than yourself, should that be a crime? I don't think so.
I just talked to a DEA guy the other day who said that one of the challenges would be if people were smoking pot and they got in their car, it'd be more difficult to prove that they were on pot.
Well, isn't that an admission?
Versus there'd be this impairment. No, they'd have the impairment, but it would be more like with alcohol, you've got a breathalyzer test and you got the proof right there. With marijuana, it'd be more difficult.
Well, I think so, and I think that's one of the issues that will have to be established. What is impairment? For example, right now, drug test. We don't want anybody on the job site that's impaired. But the problem with drug testing for marijuana is that it doesn't test for impairment. It just simply tests for presence of THC, which can exist months after you've smoked marijuana. Not the case for alcohol. But yeah, this is one of the issues that needs to be established. And I don't smoke marijuana, I don't drink alcohol, but I've done both in my life. And the big difference between the two is that in no category is marijuana more dangerous than alcohol. Citizens of Denver 6 years ago voted to decriminalize marijuana on a campaign based on marijuana being safer than alcohol. I have always maintained that legalizing marijuana will lead to overall less substance abuse, because current alcoholics might find marijuana as a much, much safer alternative.
What do you envision as any of the downsides there? And then let's talk about the upsides. Because with any decision, there's never going to be perfection. There's going to be some things that go positive, some negative. For example, and you mentioned this in your campaign documents, prohibition. It cut way back on alcohol, but it caused all kinds of other problems. What about legalizing pot? Yeah, it might cause some problems here. What do you see as the benefits?
The benefits?
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the only two countries in the world that have effectively decriminalized drugs, one being Holland, which has effectively decriminalized drug use. The other is Portugal, which has decriminalized all drug use. Both countries have 60% the drug use as that of the United States. That's on a per capita basis, but that's marijuana, that's hard drugs, that's kids, and that's adults. It kind of flies in the face of what you think would happen. Portugal, 10 years ago, decriminalized all drugs in response to a heroin epidemic in the country. And over the last 10 years, they've shown a 50% reduction in heroin use. So what you're going to do, the plus side of this is we're going to stop 1.8 million arrests in this country. And by the way, I advocate legalizing marijuana when it comes to all the other drugs. If we legalize marijuana, we are going to take some giant strides forward in this country to look at the rest of the drug issue, all other drugs, first from a health standpoint rather than a criminal justice standpoint. And when you do that, amazingly, in my opinion, good things happen. People have problems with drugs. I just maintain that 90% of the drug problem is prohibition-related, not use-related, and that's not to discount the problems with use and abuse, so that we might actually focus on use and abuse really being the key item. We stop arresting 1.8 million people a year in this country. Perhaps we can empty prisons of some of some of the 2.3 million people that are now behind bars in this country. We have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and the majority category of those imprisoned is on drug-related crime. Now, it's never going to be legal to do crime and do drugs. Never. But in federal prison, the main category of federal prisoners are those individuals that have sold small amounts of drugs on numerous occasions and been caught. My kids. I love my kids first and foremost. So what message am I sending to my kids? What I'm sending to my kids is look, I want you to understand what these substances are. I want you to understand that when it comes to hard drugs, the quantity is unknown. You may die as a result of ingesting something that you have no idea what it is. If you find yourself in a situation where you become impaired, and this is what I told my kids when they were growing up, if you find yourself in a situation where you're impaired, I want you to call me. I'm going to come pick you up, no questions asked, because I love you, first and foremost.
This might not apply to a presidential campaign, but you had mentioned on these other drugs beyond marijuana, I take it cocaine, crack, methamphetamine, things of this kind. You say you'd want to treat it as a health issue first, criminal issue second.
Yeah.
What would that look like? Are you talking about some kind of centers of treatments?
For a second. You said the three things you mentioned: crack, cocaine, and methamphetamine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is the best example. And by the way, this came from judges in Portland, Oregon, when I was governor of New Mexico, who asked to meet me, and I didn't know how that meeting was going to go, but here's how it went. They said, first of all, we are here to support you in everything that you're saying. We think that you're right on, but maybe we can share with you anecdotally a story here that will help you communicate the drug issue. They said methamphetamine is really the horrible drug out there. It alters behavior. People do bad things when they use methamphetamine. They said methamphetamine is the best example we can think of a prohibition drug. It wouldn't exist but for prohibition because it's cheap and it's easy to make. So the consequences of methamphetamine disparagingly fall on the poor. They said, we're not suggesting the following, but if cocaine were legal, people would use cocaine instead of methamphetamine without the negative behavioral consequence of methamphetamine. Now, I will tell you, and this is back to looking at drugs first as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue, cocaine does a number on your cardiovascular system. What if the government treated cocaine as a health issue first? How about the truth? You use cocaine and you are going to severely impact your cardiovascular system. You're going to put holes in your heart. People my age that have been using cocaine their entire lives have died from cardiovascular failure.
And that's where people will say, well, look, all these people start using drugs. All of a sudden, they're going to be a big burden on society because even though some might say, well, if you use it, we'll just, that's your problem. You're going to have to bear the consequences. Societies have shown that they're unwilling to allow people to suffer those kinds of consequences. So they end up on the social safety net, overburdening government. What do you do?
Well, so take the other side of that story just for a second, which is the medical marijuana phenomenon that has kind of swept over the country. The notion that if you find relief using marijuana as opposed to prescription painkillers, that you should be allowed to do that. So on one side, you're talking about a safety net that is going to be impacted by more people using drugs. I'm going to argue that the negative consequence of drugs is the prohibition phenomenon. Crack cocaine is a prohibition phenomenon. When crack cocaine first came on the scene, you had a lot of people using crack cocaine, but in a very short amount of time, in a period of years, the using community themselves recognized how dangerous crack cocaine was, and basically the practice stopped. And crack cocaine is a way to make to make cocaine cheaper and a harder high, if you will, a higher high. Same phenomenon we went through when we prohibited alcohol. That we were a beer-drinking nation before Prohibition. After Prohibition, that's when hard liquor hit the scene because it was cheaper and you got a higher high for less money.
I had a fascinating conversation with a pastor a while back making a conservative argument for legalization of drugs. And his argument was that with all the things that are going on in South America, particularly in Mexico, and we had started this conversation because I'd read about this village that had to dig this trench all the way around its village. Not that it's normal to dig a moat in the desert, right? They're just digging these trenches to try and keep the drug dealers' vehicles out of there because they're so super funded. Basically, the demand in the United States has created super armies of criminals down there that get to run the show. And his argument was that while people want marijuana to stay illegal because it's immoral, at least for some, he was arguing that it's more immoral to allow innocent people in villages in Mexico to have to defend their meager homes by digging ditches with pitchforks against supercharged armies of drug dealers that are getting all their money from the appetite of recreational users in the United States.
40,000 deaths south of the border over the last 4 years with Mexico. These are disputes that are being played out with guns rather than the courts.
Let's turn it around now to some of the social issues here. One of your platforms here on your website was government has to be neutral on personal beliefs. How would that manifest itself?
Well, the notion that a woman should have the right to choose, marriage equality. Constitutionally guaranteed rights, I think, that
Now, what do you mean?
First of all,
when you say constitutionally guaranteed, that strikes me as odd if you're an originalist, because clearly the Founding Fathers were not in favor of all kinds of things that are here now. So what are you actually saying there?
Well, that perhaps they may not have even considered it, but I think written into the Constitution are these guarantees, are these civil rights that we all have. When it comes to marriage equality, I would argue that that is a civil right, and that it is guaranteed by that civil right.
When you say you say here in it, it's government should not impose its values upon marriage. It should allow marriage equality, including gay marriage. It should also protect the rights of religious organizations to follow their beliefs. Well, first of all, I should ask, do you think government should be in marriage at all? Because you are running on the Libertarian ticket. This might not even apply.
Well, I started off actually with a position of government should not be involved in marriage at all, that marriage should be left to the churches and government should be sanctioning civil unions. What I came to find out is that the word marriage is contained in thousands of lines of federal law, and literally there would have to be an amendment to every one of those thousands of lines. It wouldn't be just one piece of legislation that would offer up a sweeping change the word marriage in all federal law. By supporting marriage equality, you wouldn't have to go through that. There wouldn't have to be a line of federal law changed.
I'm curious.
A little bit on the pragmatic side of implementing it.
One of the things here is that when it says government should not impose its values upon marriage, in Massachusetts, for example, when there was a case where the kids were going to school, Massachusetts legalized same-sex marriage, and there was some teaching at, I can't remember, it was primary or elementary school. There was a book that showed up, and it was dealing with these kinds of issues, and parents were upset, saying, why should they be dealing with these issues? And basically the courts came down and said, well, if you don't introduce these kinds of concepts and relationships in the schools as you would any other kind of mom and dad relationship, then you're being de facto discriminatory. Do you think that should be the case?
You know, these are really the decisions that get left to municipalities and states. Do I think that I being the school choice advocate that I am, being school vouchers, bringing competition to public education, I just think we should have a zillion choices when it comes to education, not just the public educational system.
Should the state reserve the right to favor a mom and a dad versus other kinds of couplings?
I don't think so.
Is it important for a child to have both a mom and a dad?
When it comes to the state government or government, I'm assuming perhaps that adoption would be a good example.
Well, I'm thinking if there's an adoption and all other things being equal, you have a mom and a dad, and then you might have two guys that want to be dads, or two women who want to be moms, or what have you. would it be okay for the state to say, we believe that a mom and a dad are important for a child's development, therefore we'll favor the mom and the dad?
I don't think the state should be able to do that. If it came down to that question, the state could implement a coin flip in that situation. Private placement of adoption should be able to exert those kinds of decisions as long as they're not receiving government funds. That's how I would parse that.
What do you think is the essential thing for people to know about your campaign right now? I mean, because a lot of people are going to say, look, Libertarian candidate, the most they've got before is 1%. So they're going to say, Gary Johnson can't win this thing. What would you tell them?
Well, here's the pie-in-the-sky scenario. The pie-in-the-sky scenario is, and first of all, I would love to be the Libertarian nominee. I'm vying to become the Libertarian nominee.
By the way, maybe you should have stuck around on the Republican side of things, because the way things are looking, it could end up at a convention. And if Newt Gingrich is right on the 6th or 8th ballot, who knows who could show up? Could have been Gary Johnson, alternative to everybody else.
Well, I've found a home here. I've come out of the closet. I arguably got to serve 8 years as governor of New Mexico being a Libertarian under the guise of being a Republican. So this is a good move for me. But here's the pie-in-the-sky scenario. Pie-in-the-sky scenario, Libertarian candidate for president is going to be on the ballot in all 50 states. There may only be 3 parties that can lay claim to that come general election time: Libertarians, Democrats, Republicans. If the Libertarian candidate for president polls at 15%, then the Libertarian candidate for president will be on the national debate stage with Obama, and I'm going to believe for the Republicans it's going to be Romney. If that's the case, I think anything is possible. I would also like to add that if the Libertarian nominee for president ends up getting 5% in the general election, the Libertarian Party will get $90 million in federal matching funds, which could be a real game changer for the Libertarian Party.
A little bit of irony there. The Libertarian Party's banking on getting the federal bucks.
Well, not banking on it. I mean, it just shows how game the system is with the hundreds.
Hey, I'm not blaming you.
No,
I think. Look, you gotta fight fire with fire.
Blame. Yeah. I'm not taking it as blame at all. I'm just laying it out here, and I happen to think that libertarians perhaps embrace the best of both parties. How many times have you heard that when you were going to college that if you weren't a Democrat, you didn't have a heart? And how many times have you heard that after you graduated from college, if you didn't turn to become a Republican, you didn't have a brain? Well, I think we've all got hearts and brains. I think we really do care about people that are in need. I just think we've gone way over the line and that we need to do all of it in the context of not spending more money than what we take in. And then from a civil liberties standpoint, do we really want government making decisions for us that if they make those decisions for us, maybe they end up criminalizing activity that otherwise would just be personal activity that you and I engage in?
There's a new book out. What is it? Break a Law Every Day, or I forget what it is, but it's this lawyer out of New York wrote it and had him on, where he said that there's so many laws now that your average person, it's 3 felonies a day. That's right, 3 felonies a day. Really a fascinating story. Real quickly, though, do you have any feelers out to – Ron Paul is known to run in the Republican primaries and then endorse somebody else. Any feelers out there, or any work with the Paul campaign with your campaign?
No, but where does that support go? Where does that support go when I think Ron Paul ends up short of getting the Republican nomination?
There's no question about that mathematically now. I mean, there's no question he's not going to make it. Yeah. It's like Newt Gingrich. Newt has more delegates, and I think he'd have to win 85% of the remaining delegates. Let's face it. No, it's better odds of me jumping out on the street and landing on the moon somewhere than that's going to happen. So, not going to happen. So, are you saying that has there been any talk between you and Ron Paul as far as, hey?
No. But at the core of Ron Paul support, I think, are people that really do have hearts and minds, and leaving them to their own demise, I think they'd like to see the message continue.
Governor,
I hate to speak on behalf of anybody else.
Governor, you're going to make a horrible president if you're not willing to speak on. They always say, on behalf of the American people, you'd have to get used to that kind of thing. You'd be speaking on behalf of everybody.
Well, and if I were elected, I would have that mandate to be able to do that very comfortably.
There you go.
Very comfortably.
Governor Johnson, great to talk to you.
David, great being on with you. Thank you.